The idea of the sports business as it exists is relatively new to Japan. When the J.League started, there were no football executives. There were no people who had been running professional clubs for decades, as was the case in Europe. Watching Japan go from the 2010 World Cup, when they were very much considered underdogs in that group and got great results and made it to the round of 16, to 2022 taking down Spain, taking down Germany. Both men's and women's teams have seen their attendances skyrocket since the stadium opened last year. And more importantly, in a city where baseball dominated politically for decades, now football has a home.
Welcome to the Football Economy, the show where we explore the business, culture, and economics of the beautiful game around the world. Today, we're diving deep into Japanese football with Dan Orlowitz. Dan is one of the most respected Western voices in Japanese football. A longtime resident of Tokyo, Dan spent over 5 years covering football at the Japanese Times, building a reputation for deeply contextualized reporting on the J.League, national teams, and Japanese unique football culture. Known for his ability to bridge sporting analysis with cultural insight, and is a trusted expert for global audiences seeking to understand how football reflects broader themes in Japanese society. Great to have you on, Dan. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me, Abraham. Great to be on.
Right, so let's get into it. So the first thing I'd like to ask is basically, obviously, I've seen some of the stuff that you've posted recently, and obviously I've tried to do a deep dive into your background. But tell me, from your perspective, what's the most interesting thing that you've come across in Japan that keeps on reinforcing your love for the country?
I've been here 18 years now, more than 18, getting pretty close to the half my life total in Japan stage of things. And even just in Tokyo, one city, technically it's a metropolis officially, the fact that I can live here as long as I have, and every day I can go out and discover something new. The culture is always evolving in terms of what's out there in the sporting world, in the pop culture scene. I did a lot of work in the music scene prior to sports journalism. There's just everything. Every day is a surprise, and it's such an incredible country to live in, such an incredible city to live in. Really, I wouldn't have it any other way.
Right, this is well understood. I mean, I think you're a big fan of anime, and this is probably how you ventured into Japanese culture. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Serial Experiments Lane, which was like a late 90s anime series. Does that sort of still reinforce the way you write about Japanese culture in terms of fusing the anime culture that is obviously very predominant in Japanese culture into your sporting worldview?
As a very, very deep cut, that was the first anime I ever watched, and despite the fact that it's sort of late 90s, early 2000s, does speak a lot as to modern society and how we deal with information and social media, especially. So yeah, my background is in anime pop culture. That was what attracted me to Japan, and what I found is that a lot of what I studied at that time, especially when it comes to participatory fandom, how anime fans engage with those properties and create sort of their own content, their own narratives. A lot of that does apply to how sports fans in Japan, sort of how they approach their favorite teams, their favorite players, their favorite sports. And what we've seen over time globally is that way of interactive fandom has taken root in the United States. When you look at how fans interact with NBA Twitter, for example, how figure skating fans engaged with each other, especially during Yuzuru Hanyu's big real rise in the 2010s when he won 2 Olympic Games. And having that background does sort of make it easier. And I I don't call myself a sports guy who likes nerdy things. I call myself a nerd who likes sports. And I enjoy being able to walk between those two worlds because for the longest time, people who covered covered culture, and people who covered sports covered sports. And these days, they intersect and interact in so many different ways that I think it is important that you understand both.
Mm. Yeah, well stated, and I do agree with you when it comes to trying to merge the two and keep it seamless in terms of trying to make sure it's very coherent of a story or narrative. If that's the case, if that's the sort of like story you're trying to tell. But in terms of like your worldview, you said that Japanese culture, in terms of sports, you've used sport to try to explain Japanese culture in that sense. Can you sort of like unpack that for us from a philosophy perspective? How do you undertake that, and how do you make sure that, let's say, you're writing a piece for the Guardian? How do you make sure that you're always being conscious of the fact that Japanese culture is still, still considered unknown, in terms of what it really entails?
I think that a challenge when it comes to reporting on Japan is that a lot of it tends to be, especially some of the more widely read work out there, it is from so-called outsiders or people who have come into Japan. For example, when the Olympics were here 5 years, 4 years ago now, all of these journalists are coming in and they're all writing stories about, well, convenience stores and all these snacks, and that's sort of one example. It's a very surface example, but they're writing something that we've known forever. Nothing particularly novel, but they are bringing it to their audience who maybe was not aware of those things. And I think that they will come in with certain presumptions and assumptions about Japan that will tint their writing and their approach. I try to say you shouldn't look at Shohei Ohtani and say, well, of course of course he's an amazing player, very diligent and hardworking because he's Japanese. I think that the question we should be asking is, well, what in Japanese society influences how these players act, how they prepare, how they approach the game, why clubs do the things that they do from the business sense, from the grassroots sense. And it is in some ways a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, but I try to use my writing and my reporting to tell people about Japanese culture. I think that learning about the national high school soccer tournament, the championships that happen every December and January, understanding that is to understand how Japan has approached grassroots football for more than a century, and to understand how seriously it treats the youth section, the youth levels of the game. The fact that that championship can sell out the national stadium, 50,000 people watching two high schools play a football game, nowhere in the world can you get that. And so I try to say, well, this is what's happening and this is why. And I try to use those, that's the jumping off point.
Yeah, it's a clear point you're making about how Japanese basically develops its football philosophy. And when we talk about the Japanese national team, I do know that they have a philosophy called the Japan's Way, and which you basically, not to go too deep into it, but basically explains the sort of like strategy they want to embody when they take in consideration about how they want to approach football from like you said, from the grassroots all the way to the men's national team and J.League itself. But can you explain to the audience and also to myself, how does this strategy allow, or this philosophy allows them to potentially obtain this World Cup trophy that they've stated is their goal in 2050, if I'm not mistaken, in 25
Yep,
years?
that is correct. They've set a number of very lofty goals, and a World Cup title in 2050 for the men, I should say. Obviously, the women got theirs in 2011, but that's the big one. And so Japan's way is the national philosophy, and to really briefly summarize it is that the development of the national team, development at the grassroots level, and development at the coaching level in terms of of training coaches and turning them into managers and turning them into elite managers. That's all happening together. It's not as a situation where one is walled off from the others. They're not existing in bubbles. They're not happening independently of each other. And that is to a very important thing to understand about Japanese football is that all of the development that has taken place over the last 35, 40 or so years, it is all in service of helping Japan win the World Cup. And that is how Japan has approached the game. That is why the J.League was established. to raise the level of play, to help Japanese players improve, to create a national team that would be strong enough to qualify. And we might be sort of transitioning topics, but what we've seen happen is that the J League has focused on the grassroots approach, on the player development approach, and now that that has reliably been built up, now the league is starting to shift its business approach so that it can be financially competitive with the rest of the world. So it's not as in, for example, some other countries where the league and the FA are maybe not in lockstep. They may have their own agendas. They may cooperate to some extent. In Japan's case, it is fully they're arm in arm trying to improve Japanese football to the point where Japan can lift that trophy in about 25 years.
Mm. Yeah, and this says a lot about the organizational thinking that Japan has and is known for. And this approach is also seen in this approach in terms of having a very coherent strategy, a framework of how to approach winning a World Cup trophy. And this is why you see, PIF, the Saudi Wealth Fund, but also the whole organizational front trying to see where they can leverage best practices from the Japanese way of like doing things. They haven't gone to the MLS, and that's very telling. Yeah. So I mean, you've mentioned that the women's team won the World Cup in 2011, which was astounding. But if I ask you now, what you'd consider the most impressive phase of Japanese evolution in terms of Japanese football during your time there? You've been there for almost 20 years, 18 years now. What would that be?
Wow, that's if you're talking on the pitch, I think that if I go back to say the first national team game I attended as a fan was in the spring of 2005. I was a study abroad student. I think it was a dead rubber World Cup qualifier against Bahrain, one of those. And at the time, nearly all of Japan's squad was based in the J League. There were a handful of players who were based in Europe, but for the most part, everyone was in Japan. Fast forward to now, nearly the entire squad is based in Europe. Japan could, in fact, build an A squad, a B squad, and a C squad from its Europe based players. In the last decade, you've gone from 15 or 20 to well over 100. And I think those numbers alone are a testament to how how strong the assembly line has become in a way. And even to call it an assembly line isn't really fair because obviously these players are all very unique and they have a lot of different talents. But the J League is just churning them out at this point, and it's not just the J League; it's high schools, it's universities, it's amateur clubs in some cases. Just watching watching Japan go from the 2010 World Cup when they were very much considered underdogs in that group and got great results and made it to the round of 16 to 2022, taking down Spain, taking down Germany, two countries that have had a lot of influence on Japanese football development. That was a very sort of student becomes the master situation. And it was a moment I think we were all disappointed when Japan didn't get through Croatia in that round of 16. But the future is just bright and getting brighter, and you can see that in the development and the number of players who continue to emerge and go to Europe and exceed there.
Yeah, I mean, if I do a recollection of my most prominent memory of Japanese football, I'd say it's the 2002 Korea Japan World Cup. I was pretty young then, and I remember watching that and falling in love with. I mean, I already liked Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z, but falling in love with the atmosphere of the Japanese in the Japanese stadium, and obviously seeing the way the Japanese players played with, and this is where I'm going to go to a question now, but seeing the way they play with agility, with the tenacity, with intensity, obviously they didn't have the same physique, and this is something that's the leadership in Japan has obviously stated clearly of we don't have the same physique, the same power as the Europeans or other national teams, but what we do have is the tenacity, the sort of like the higher level thinking. And I would like to ask, is this something that is like a clear part of their strategy, or is this something that just comes from the fact that it comes innately? So it's more nature than nurture.
I think that they're trying to find a balance between that because the other thing when it comes to physique, especially in endurance, when Japanese players are going to Europe, they do have to be able to hang with in some very physically aggressive leagues. The Premier League is not an easy competition. The speed of the game is at a different level. The intensity of the tackles, just the aggressiveness on both sides of the ball. And so I think that we are seeing more care put into development on the nutritional side, on the training side, figuring out how to get players ready for those kinds of environments. And at the same time, you do have, yes, Japanese players are never going to be as big or as strong as, say, players from Brazil, players from a number of European countries, players from Africa. There are gaps there, but the JFA's hope is that the tactics, the techniques will triumph in the end, and that they can find the best of both worlds. And we're also seeing things. The J.League from next year will be shifting to a fall-spring schedule mirroring Europe. And what they hope will come from that, one of many things they hope will come from that, is that by avoiding the middle of the season taking place in the hottest months of the year, Japanese players will be fitter, they will be less prone to injury, and they will be able to get the best performance out of them for more of the season, rather than starting strongly and then dipping and then getting close to the starting line in, say, October, November.
Yeah, it seems like it's a trend from leagues across the world that don't follow the European, or I should say the Western calendar. I think the MLS is also transitioning towards that. I think they have a working group to decide, but for the most part, it should be happening in the next 2 years. And so it's interesting to see Japan is already undertaking that in 2026. But just to give the listeners and viewers more of a structural sort of like newest understanding of how specific Japanese football is when it comes to from a governance perspective, not just governance, from a strategy perspective. I do know there's this thing called the Trinitarian Strengthening Plan, which basically integrates the national team development, the youth development, and then coaching training with so-called shared knowledge. Can you just extrapolate that for us? Just as a way for us to nerd out on how Japanese football is sort of like organized in that sense.
Sorry, I know you can cut that. I feel like we sort of covered that a little in the previous question. You mean just sort of as a whole, or?
Yeah, so they say, if I'm not mistaken, they say that you cannot have one part be strengthened without strengthening the other two. So
Oh, yeah.
is that
Okay.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that it's sort of what I alluded to earlier, that you can't have this sort of development in a bubble.
Mm,
And I think that what you have, I'll give one example, which is grassroots player development,
mm,
where when the J.League started, the main producer of players, such as it were, the main pathway was high schools, and
mm.
then to a certain extent, universities. Then when the J.League was established, all the clubs established their academies and started developing those under 18 teams, eventually under 15s, under 12s, that sort of thing. And now what you have in present day is that you can join a J.League academy and hopefully go pro through that, or you can go to a high school and play in what is a very competitive environment, and that can include regional competitions. That can include the JFA's, the Prince Takamoto Cup, or excuse me, the Prince Takamoto Under 18 Premier League. Some of our competition titles get very long, but it is essentially a national under 18 competition that's, split into East and West. There are high schools that run A through E teams that compete in various levels, plus, of course, the prefectural and national tournaments. So you can do that. Or if you turn 18 and decide that for whatever reason you want to develop further, you can go to university. And so in the United States, for example, most of the development was happening at the university level, and through private teams, through high schools. But then kids would go through universities, then graduate and be drafted. Now, MLS academies are at the point where they're regularly producing players, and they have MLS Next. And the value of universities, of the NCAA system for developing players, has dropped a bit. And the United States Federation is trying to reconcile that. In Japan, their perspective is that all of these pathways are important. All of these pathways are taken seriously. And so that's one aspect. You do have uh, the national team development, all of the training centers, the JFA Academy up in Fukushima, and those are players that the JFA is working with at a team and individual level to develop, and that's another way that they're developing talent. Then you have the coaching side of things, which is, if we're being honest, where Japan needs the most help in terms of, we have players who are at a world-class standard. Now we need coaches that are at a world-class standard. And so that's the next challenge, is, again, figuring out how to not allow coaching to fall behind playing level. And I think that we're going to see a lot of investment from the Japanese football community into that over the next few years. But just figuring out how to not just get Japanese coaches who are able to coach a national team at the World Cup, but how to create Japanese coaches who can coach in Europe, who can manage elite clubs. That's the next challenge that Japan faces.
Yeah, so I mean, it's almost like a throwback to when Japan had coaches such as Arsene Wenger. Even Zico, obviously, he was a player and he helped professionalize the standard of being a professional in Japanese football. So it's almost like, in a way, they're trying to take back some of the wins, or the developments they had in the past, and incorporate that with a more coherent or comprehensive strategy. So thanks for sort of like broadening that for us. And you mentioned that Japan is moving away from the current calendar and are more aligned with the Western calendar, or the European football calendar. And I do know that they're also shifting towards basic remuneration for players in terms of salary, which is obviously not the case in most of the top 5 European leagues, if not all the European leagues. I think Belgium is different. Obviously, the salaries are not that not on the same level as what you'd see in the top 5 leagues in Europe. But do you think this is something that makes sense from a perspective of a fan watching players day to day? Do you think having this very basic minimum salary is the way to go? Obviously, there are logistical reasons behind this and obviously commercial reasons behind this, but from a fan perspective and a practitioner, observer of Japanese football, is this the way to go?
I don't think, to be honest, that the abolishment of what we call Pro A, Pro B, and Pro C contracts, I don't see fans being particularly affected by that in terms of the end product that they're seeing. Just to explain to your viewers and listeners, that the reason for this change is that essentially you would, if you joined the J.League as a rookie, as a first year player, you start at a C contract. A B is a bit nebulous, but essentially you get an A contract after you have played a certain number of minutes. I don't remember exactly what the requirement is, but it's not particularly egregious, especially if you're playing regularly for the first team. And each of those levels had certain floors and ceilings. And not Pro A doesn't have a ceiling except in your first season, but essentially they were rookie contracts. Just to simplify things. And what the J.League, one of the biggest issues that the J.League has, is figuring out how do you retain talent and how do you maximize the amount of talent that is going into the league. Because one of the biggest concerns now is, what if more high school and university players go straight into Europe? Obviously, that benefits Japanese football from the national team perspective, potentially. It does not benefit clubs who are not going to be receiving potential transfer fees for these players. So in getting rid of these contracts, what they're trying to do is make it so that clubs can offer more favorable terms to younger talents, including the potential for longer contracts as rookies. And that way, if they emerge to be breakout talents and attract interest from Europe, the club is in a better position to negotiate from a stronger perspective when it comes to transfer fees, sell-on fees, that sort of thing.
Yeah, this is very clear. And in terms of the sort of the evolution of the J-League itself, I know obviously they started with 10 clubs to begin with, and then now they have probably 60 clubs across J1 to J3, so J2 included, obviously. And then obviously they just crossed that 11 million milestone in terms of having, the stadium attendance or match attendance, and that's been impressive. But from your perspective, what do you think is the underlying economics behind this? Like, what does this tell us about the economic health of Japanese football in terms of seeing the way they've recovered from the pandemic, and then considering all the all the mechanisms that have implemented over time that has resulted in this crossing of this 11 million threshold of stadium attendance?
I think overall, the financial health of the game is very healthy. It's very strong. I think that in my opinion, the league did everything it was supposed to do to get through the pandemic. I actually don't think the J.League gets enough credit for how it handled itself during the pandemic. I think that they were one of the best leagues in the world when it came to all of that. That's perhaps another episode entirely. I think if you're looking at the financials and the economics of the individual clubs, that's where it gets a little trickier. And again, this is where understanding Japanese culture and Japanese business culture comes into mind. You have to remember that most of these clubs are owned by Japanese corporations. And so there's a very clear difference between clubs that are run as sporting entities, like most European clubs are. I think it's fair to say they may be owned by private investors or families or individuals, but they are run as sports clubs and intended to make profits as sports clubs. Whereas in Japan, we have some of those, but we also have clubs that are child companies of their parents, and that can mean Yokohama F. Marinos, who are owned by Nissan. That can mean Nagoya Grampus, who are owned by Toyota. That can mean Gamba Osaka, who are owned by Panasonic. And this means different things for different clubs. Again, this all depends on what the parent company expects and what their vision is for how they run their team. Some companies treat their teams as clubs. They're trying to maximize profits. They're trying to generate revenue. Others treat teams more as a billboard, where any deficit, any red ink at the end of the year just gets written off as advertising, or they refill the bank account and move on to the next season. So what the J League wants is to increase club revenues by 50 to 100% over the next 10 or so years, I believe by 2030. That's the goal. So they want to see a club like Urawa Reds, who generated, I believe, 11 billion yen in revenue last year. So they want to see that turn into 22 billion yen, which is close to 120 million US, something like, or actually it might be 1.2. You'll have to edit some magic numbers onto the screen because I cannot do the conversions in my head at the moment. But so that's a big challenge. And some clubs you see in terms of how they're conducting their sponsorship activities, how they're developing revenue streams. Some clubs are very good at it. Some clubs are learning to be good at it. Some clubs are not necessarily there.
Right. Right, that's very clear. And then in terms of sort of the one club that comes to mind when you talk about Japan or Japanese football is the Vissel Kobe. Obviously, this is a club that Iniesta joined after retiring from Barcelona, and I think this is the only reason why a lot of non-Japanese football followers know about the club. And obviously, from what I've gathered so far, they didn't win the back-to-back trophies as a result of Iniesta coming in. It was actually because of the actual homegrown players, which is interesting in its own right. But what do you think this says about the strategy going forward? If they've decided to bring in players like David Villa, Lucas Podolski, Spanish, German, but then the homegrown players end up helping them win the actual league back to back. What's the strategy going forward then? How do they make sure they strike a balance between homegrown players and players from overseas?
So that's a very interesting question, and it raises a lot of good points. To understand the Iniesta strategy, you have to go back to the start of the J League when they did bring in a number of top foreign stars, Zico included, who we talked about earlier, to raise interest in the league and to give these players someone to look up to, role models on and off the pitch. And that was Vissel Kobe's intention when they brought in Podolski and Iniesta. So Vissel Kobe are owned by Rakuten, one of Japan's biggest e-commerce companies. They're giants, sort of the Japanese Amazon, plus a number of other things. And Hiroshi Mikitani, the owner and founder of Rakuten, he is a football fan. He's a sports fan in general. He bought the Rakuten Golden Eagles, the pro baseball team. He bought Vissel Kobe. He actually changed their branding, their colors to match Harvard, which is where he went to business school. And so he wanted to create sort of the Barcelona of the East. You'll remember that around when Iniesta came to Japan, that's also when Rakuten started sponsoring Barcelona's uniforms. It was a very expensive deal. So the vision was that, well, if you bring in a bunch of European stars, they'll be able to win the league, surely. The reality was that Podolski, quite frankly, his attitude on the pitch was not always phenomenal. He had a bit of an ego to him. I don't think he's going to. If he hears me, I'm not sorry. I stand by that. It's nothing I haven't written before. And Iniesta, while he was an amazing player, there's only one of him, and he was surrounded by 10 players who weren't Andres Iniesta. And yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on. I would have loved for there to be a Netflix documentary on what happened at Vissel, and just the managerial musical chairs that happened 2 or 3 times a season while Iniesta was there. And yes, eventually they did win the title with homegrown players, with good Japanese players, and by bringing in a number of top former national team players. Yuya Osako, Yoshinori Muto, strong talent who in the J-League, in this era of the J-League, those are great talents. Build a team around them, they will win you the league. So no, Iniesta didn't exactly contribute to those last 2 titles by Vissel, but what he did contribute was earning Vissel Kobe a lot of money. The sponsorships, the ticket sales, the uniform sales, the brand recognition that Vissel got from being featured on news stations and around the world. And the J-League benefited from this as well, obviously. The biggest shame of that whole thing, the Iniesta era, was that we didn't get to build on 2019, which was record attendance for the league because of the pandemic. Since then, the J-League has taken a bit of a different tack marketing-wise, but clubs haven't for various reasons, clubs haven't gone all in on another Iniesta-like player, which you would like to see it in some ways, but in other ways, it does speak to the strength of the league and the strength of the league's marketing strategy, that the J-League doesn't need Iniesta back to get to those 2019 numbers, which it's managed to do in this last year or so.
Right. And also when it comes to bringing in a player like Iniesta, there are other things that are taken into consideration outside of just the playing ability. I'm sure you know this, in terms of making sure that the player's personality, like you mentioned Podolski, the player's personality is sort of like aligned with Japanese culture, and probably that's where Iniesta tick those boxes. And it's going to be very hard to find similar players at the same playing level that also check those boxes, because not everyone has those balances in that case. But there's something that fascinates me when I was doing my research for this session, and that's the Kokuritsu Day. This is fascinating. Can you, explain that to us? What does it mean? What is the significance? What are the implications, the history of it?
So Kokuritsu Kyogijo is the Japanese name of the national stadium located in Tokyo. The original was built ahead of the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, and the current version was built in the 2010s ahead of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, which took place in 2021. When the J-League launched in 1993, Kokuritsu was the league decided that it was hallowed ground, that it would be a neutral venue that would serve as sort of a showcase of the league and of the teams. So teams would play games there, but it was more meant as a way to bring Japanese football to the public in a in terms of the high production, I say production quality, but just they brought out the pyrotechnics and the smoke and the the lights and all of that. And of course, you can go onto YouTube and look up the opening ceremony of that first game, May 15th, 1993. And you'll see the gigantic J.League king, the mascot, the inflatable thing that's 30 feet tall, and the guitar player, all that. And so once it was always sort of an iconic venue that was never used as a primary home ground. It was used as an occasional home ground by Tokyo area clubs. It was used as the venue for cup finals, the J-League Cup, the Emperor's Cup, and it was occasionally used for national team games, at least until the national team moved to Saitama Stadium for competitive fixtures. Once the stadium was rebuilt and once COVID got to the point where they could start using that stadium in the full sense in the way that it was meant to be used, let's put it, the J-League from a couple years back started a very aggressive strategy of using it about a dozen times a year, roughly. And it calls those games sort of Kokuritsu Day, sort of National Stadium Day. And they're using that as a way to introduce new fans to the J-League. So they're bringing in special, musical guests. They're doing fireworks shows. They are giving away a lot of free tickets to these games. Something north of 10,000 tickets per game. And in order to get those tickets, you have to register on the J-League's app and give them your information. And if you're a first-time registrant, you can enter to win these free tickets. So what the league found in 2023, I think they hosted 9 or 10 of these Kokuritsu Day games, is that of the free tickets, of the people who received free tickets, 35% went on to go to another J-League game. So from the league's perspective, that's a good investment because what the league sees in terms of bringing in fans, that it's the league's job to bring in the new fans. And then it's the club's job to turn them into regular fans. And so that's the cycle that the league is trying to promote. And by using Kokuritsu, which is, I have my criticisms of it, but it is incredibly convenient to Tokyo. It is gorgeous when it's full. And the atmosphere when it is full is incredible. And so by leveraging that, if you can get 50, 60,000 people in to watch some hopefully good football with great, you have tifos from the fans and lots of cheering and all that. A lot of people who are coming in for the first time will see that and go, well, I want to go to an FC Tokyo game. I want to go to a Tokyo Verdy game. I want to go see Nagoya Grampus or Shimizu S-Pulse. And so that's been a very successful strategy for the league over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, it's fascinating just hearing you talk about it. It's something that clearly comes from a very deeper sort of like strategy and not a short term thing in that sense. And just to go deeper into this idea of trying to create like a organic way of recruiting fans or bringing in new audiences into football. I do know that Japan has its own way of creating like multi-purpose stadiums in terms of considering the fact that Japanese population is obviously aging and this is well known. In your perspective, how does the strategy of creating like stadiums that are seen as disaster prevention centers and medical care and health centers, how does this reinforce the Japanese way in that sense?
What we've seen over the last 15 years or so is a shift. If you look at a lot of I'll sort of rewind about 20 years to explain this, but if you look at the teams that were joining the second division, the J2 from 1999 through roughly 2010 or so, a lot of those teams were playing in athletic stadiums. They were tracked, they were very cheap, they were built to they were built and owned by the prefecture or the municipality so that they could host national track meets, national athletic meets, summer sports festivals, or the National Sports Festival, which is high school and university level competitions. But that's what those stakeholders are trying to win over. Whereas a football stadium is obviously meant to host football games.
Right.
So they don't want to build a football stadium that can only host, say, 50 events a year, if that, really 20 league games plus maybe a few other things. So the challenge that teams that want to play in better stadiums have is, how do you convince local stakeholders, how do you convince municipalities to build a football stadium, or to at least let you build a football stadium? And so where these clubs are having increasing amounts of success is in building spaces that aren't just for football, but they can host other events as well. They can host other sports. They can serve as community gathering points. Kyoto's new stadium, Sanga Stadium, it's near Kameoka Station. It's gorgeous. It has to be 6 or 7 years ago at this point. Another one that I'm incredibly bullish on, I should say in full disclosure, I've done some related work to this project, is Peace Wing, Edion Peace Wing Hiroshima, which is the home of Sanfrecce Hiroshima's men's and women's teams. That is a wildly successful stadium that seats 27,000 people. It is right in the Peace Park. It is a 10-minute walk from the Peace Memorial and the museum. It is centrally located in the middle of downtown Hiroshima. You can get there by bus, trolley, train. There is a park, plaza. You can hang out there. You can go into the stadium on match days and or on non-match days, let's just say, and check it out. There is a Hiroshima football museum, and both men's and women's teams have seen their attendances skyrocket since the stadium opened last year. And more importantly, in a city where baseball dominated politically for decades, now football has a home. And now football is being treated with much more respect than it used to. And so, again, this is another thing where, to understand Japanese sports is to understand Japanese culture. Understanding the football-baseball divide in Hiroshima is massive towards understanding the national divide between those two sports, and the differences in the stakeholders, and why baseball is solidly the number one sport and football is solidly the number two. So you see these changes happening, and more clubs, more clubs than ever, are playing in dedicated football venues. More clubs than ever are building their own clubhouses and turning those into community facilities. I believe Mito Hollyhock's new clubhouse was built. They used a former elementary school and have turned into a clubhouse / community center. So we're really starting to get into it. And all of this goes back to how clubs don't just exist to win trophies. They exist to integrate themselves with their communities, within their communities, and to be parts of their communities and to develop those communities. And that's something that the J.League, it's within the tenets of the J.League to do that, which is why the league itself is a public benefit corporation. And the league isn't trying to make a profit. They are mandated by their bylaws to do good. And that involves a lot of things along these lines.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, I think one of the leadership in one of his speeches said that one of the founding reasons for creating a football or sports first country in Japan, or culture in Japan, is to make sure that we have a physical sort of like lifestyle, because we don't have that aspect in our our day-to-day life, and making sure that football is like a vehicle for that, making sure that it's fun and a way for communities to blend, and obviously families is very important as something that I'm watching very closely from, in terms of watching the Japanese way of doing things. There's something called the J.League ID, which is the Oshi player videos. If Can you explain that to us in terms of how it attracts new fans, and what role would you say media plays in terms of expanding the league?
Sorry, J.League ID and Oshi player. Okay, I think that maybe a couple things have been mixed up, but I will answer your question to the best of my abilities. So the J.League ID that's the ID system that the league uses for the app, and that's how it tracks all of the data, which is I think the system as it stands is about 7 or 8, maybe 8 or 9 years old. But from that time, what the league started doing is centralizing all of its marketing data and distributing it to clubs to help give them a better understanding of how to market to their fans. So you've mentioned another, again, this gets into the anime pop culture intersection. Japan has this concept called Oshikatsu, which is the act of supporting your favorite member of a team, could be a sports team, so your favorite player, athlete, could be your favorite singer in a musical group, could be your favorite anime character. And you support them by buying the merch, by cheering them on and getting the uniform and going to the games, going to the concerts and all that. And how the clubs market their players is very similar to how a lot of pop groups in Japan market their stars. And you see this a lot in just when a club releases, they'll do keychains and they'll have them for every single player. They will have towels with all the players' names and numbers on it. And so you can get your favorite. If your favorite, if a player earns his 100th league appearance or scores his 100th goal. Masato Morishige and FC Tokyo made his 500th J1 appearance the other week. FC Tokyo put out a line of merchandise celebrating that. And so that's to engage fans and to get them to buy those things and wear them proudly at games and commit to players. I've seen going to, it was a Kashima Racehall game, behind this woman on the bus. She had to be 40s or 50s, something like that, older than me at the time, certainly. And on her messenger bag, she had a row of these silicone uniform keychains, all with the same player, same number: yellow, 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 red, yellow, yellow. And that red was from the one season where that player was on loan to another club, but she still made the effort to get that keychain and keep the set complete. So that's one example I like to bring up, but it's certainly nothing the J.League invented per se. You do see that a lot in professional baseball here as well, in most other sports, but the J.League is very good at it, and some clubs especially are very good at it. Oshikatsu is a way to support your favorite player. You also see things like anime collaborations with very popular titles, and they'll do merch, and they'll have voice actors come and do a pregame performance. And so this again ties to what I was saying earlier about how if you understand how pop culture fans absorb and interact with their favorite properties, you'll understand a little bit more about how Japanese sports fans interact with their favorite things.
Yeah, and it's clear that it's something that the western part of the world, but also other markets for sports need to look into and consider if it's something that they can integrate into how sports is marketed, or the media is basically outlaid for more consumption from the fan perspective. But I know that Japan has had 7 consecutive World Cup appearances, which is quite impressive, and that's a testament to the strategy in terms of Japan's way. And there's growing international demand for or recognition for Japanese players. But if my memory is correct, I don't really see any significant transfer sort of like valuation that has struck me as very, very sort of like, massive in terms of its value. Shinji Kagawa from Dortmund to Manchester United was probably under 15 million pounds. What do you think needs to change for this sort of like valuation of Japanese players to improve over time?
The issue of the valuation of Japanese players, at least for the first leg from the J.League to Europe, that has been something that those of us who follow the Japanese game have been concerned about for a while. Quite frankly, the biggest issue there is that Japanese agents have a lot more power than perhaps they should, and they have an undue amount of influence in how deals are negotiated. And the other thing is that, again, these are clubs that exist from the development, with a development focus, not necessarily a making money focus. So they want to see their players go to Europe and succeed because that's how Japan succeeds. And it also, in theory, it should help the club's reputation as having developed players that can go to Europe and succeed, getting the amount of money that some Brazilian clubs get for their players, that some African clubs get for their players, that some Argentinian clubs get for their players. That would go a lot further than, €1 million here, 2 million euros there. So that ties back into another reason why the J.League is shifting its calendar to align the transfer windows to hopefully enable clubs to make better deals and to be able to sell their star players without destroying their lineups mid-season. In terms of being in a stronger position to negotiate better deals, yes, the club-agent relationship does need to be reconfigured, but also clubs need sporting directors and people in the front office who understand the global market and who understand how to make it work for them. And that's something that the J.League has been working on. They launched Sports Human Capital a few years ago. It's basically the league has a business school where they're creating not just sporting executives for the J.League, but for a lot of other professional leagues in Japan as well. The idea of the sports business as it exists is relatively new to Japan. When the J.League started, there were no football executives. There were no people who had been running professional clubs for decades, as was the case in Europe. We're basically speed running the development of the European football industry in a lot of ways, but we're catching up. And I think that the hope is that we do start to see those transfer fees go up because, quite frankly, that is how J.League clubs are going to survive. That is how they're going to thrive, is once they start getting more money that they can reinvest back into their academies.
Mm, yeah, this is so true. And it's something that, let's see if we see sort of like some signs or signals of progress over time. And then as we try to wrap this session up, we still have the rapid fire session also. But my final question to you is, I know that Kashima Antlers are Japan's most successful club. And from what I've seen so far, they are, my opinion, the Manchester United of Japan's football. There are many parallels there. You know, they've won a lot of trophies there. They've dominated Japanese football domestically. But then, like Manchester United, they've not actually dominated Asian football. My question to you is, why is that the case?
Wait, Manchester United haven't dominated Asian?
No, well, Manchester United
Oh,
haven't dominated European football. So they've won two Champions Leagues compared to the 20 Premier Leagues they've won. And this is probably
right.
related with how Kashima Antlers have also dominated domestically, but when it comes to the FC Champions League, they've not really dominated that.
Just the one. Okay, sorry, I understand the question better. The AFC Champions League is such a unique beast in terms of the Asian football ecosystem. Obviously, the mirror version of Kashima's dominance is that Urawa Reds have only won the J-League one time, but they've won the AFC Champions League 3 times. And now they're, as we record this, they're at the Club World Cup. So I think that you raise it. It's a very interesting question. I think that if you look at Kashima's dominance, especially in the 2000s, when they did they had 2 three-peats, 20, I think 2000 to 2002 or 2021 or 2001, 2003, and then 2006 through 2008, or rather, sorry, 2007 through 2009. Because Urawa won in 2006. I remember all these things. They played a very sort of hard-nosed defensive Iron Curtain style of football that won in Japan. For various reasons, it was not enough to get them to win in the Champions League. And of course, then they did it in 2018, and it was well overdue. There's a lot of discussion there's been a lot of discussion over the years about, well, how seriously do Japanese clubs take the Champions League? And that's a discussion for a different episode. But I think that now, these days, especially, you look at the money that goes to the Champions League winners, you look at the money that Club World Cup teams are getting. Urawa Reds are getting 9.5 billion or million with an M dollars, and that's a lot of money in the Japanese context, and that will help them make a lot of key signings. So clubs have taken notice of that, but now you're playing in an Asian ecosystem where Saudi Arabian clubs are spending a ton of money, Qatari clubs are spending a ton of money, Emirati clubs are spending a ton of money. So can Japan compete against those clubs? And that's the riddle. And it's not easy, especially with the new centralized format for the knockout stages. But Yokohama F. Marinos managed to limp their way into the final last year. This year we had a couple teams get through, and that was what it was. But that's a big challenge, is understanding Japan's understanding Japan's place in club football in Asia, because you do have a bit of a disconnect between that and where the national team is going.
No, that's awesome to hear. And then let's transition to the rapid fire round. And this is basically where I ask you a few questions and you give me the first thing that comes to mind in that sense.
Okay.
I think the first thing I'll ask is you've lived in Tokyo for close to 2 decades in that sense. What's the most important lesson you've learned about building trust and relationships in Japanese football?
It takes time and it takes being there. A lot of the best relationships that I've formed are from people who I see at games regularly. Having your business card is one of the most important things you can do in Japan. If you're coming here for business, you don't want to forget your business cards, because you may think of it as a useless bit of cardboard, but actually, like, that's something that people remember. And even today, I will be asked if I know somebody or if I know someone at a company, and I'll remember that somewhere in my little Rolodex, I have a card of someone that I met at a sports business conference 5 years ago, and I know I have it. And so I dig through and I find it. And that's here. LinkedIn is not quite caught on in Japan in the way that it has in the rest of the world. It's starting to get there among a certain class, but meeting people, forming relationships, having patience. Business takes much longer to happen in Japan than it does in the rest of the world, because building that trust does take time.
And I can imagine that once that business union is formed, it lasts for a very long time. And then the second question would be, what should if there's any European football executive listening, what should they be taken as inspiration or learnings from Japanese football into European football?
I think that any league in the world should be looking at the fan experience in Japan, especially when it comes to not just safety, but just the vibes, the atmosphere, the accessibility. I can go into the stands at a J.League game. I will see men, I will see women, I will see groups of women, I will see seniors, I will see dads with their kids, grandparents with their grandkids. They will all be behind the goal. The fact that the J League has managed to create some of these amazing atmospheres again, Club World Cup Urawa, you've seen how those supporters are like. And Urawa is a bit of a special case, but it is the league has made so much effort toward making it a league that anyone can go to a game and feel at home and feel comfortable. And anyone can do so for relatively not that much money. Tickets start at about 20 US, and you can buy beer in the stadium. That's something that England should pay attention to. Just overall, it is not just it's not just that they're not just saying, well, we're holding a football game here, come here and watch the football game. It's about planning the entire experience, about planning your entire day around being at the stadium and enjoying it, and interacting with your community there. And a lot of clubs here do that very, very well. And I think that there's a lot of clubs in Europe that could take some inspiration from that.
Right. And then the second to last question will be, what specific trends have you seen in Japanese football that investors should be considering and watching closely?
I think that the biggest investment related thing that's happened this last year has been Red Bull's purchase of Omiya Ardija. They got a very good deal for that, not just the men's team, but also the women's team. And Omiya were in a tough spot. And I think that it is telling that in a global football industry, in the global football community, where a lot of people have some concerns about Red Bull's project for various reasons. I'm not going to judge one way or other. I think that everyone has some good points, but fans here were fine with it, because Omiya supporters were kind of tired of being mistreated by NTT, who were the previous owners of Omiya. Red Bull have come in, and the team is doing very well, and they're going to be in the thick of the promotion race. So I think if the Red Bull project at Omiya is successful, if they manage to get back up to the J1 and turn Omiya back into a competitive J1 team, which they occasionally were back in, about 15, 20 years ago, but Red Bull can do that. It does show that there is a pathway for foreign investment and for different ways of thinking. And that's something that I think we welcome. I think we want to see the J League retain all of its positive qualities, but from the business perspective, I think that the league is very open to new ideas and new perspectives. So I think that in the next 10 or so years, you're going to see more foreign investors come in and start to give teams a good look. I'm always hearing rumors and things, and I would not be surprised if a couple other foreign investment teams don't come in the next few seasons.
Cool. And then the final questions would be, what's your favorite Japanese cuisine? And then the final question would be, what book has informed you the most about Japan, book which you'd suggest our listeners and viewers should read?
My favorite Japanese cuisine, that's a tough one. It's all no, it's all good. I have friends who will come here and eat ramen every day when they're visiting, and I don't know how they do it. I need to restrict it to like once a month or so, just for my just so I don't just sodium intake. It's a lot. No, but Japanese food is amazing. It's all good. They're like my children. I can't pick one, but I will eat them all. As far as a book, that's a tough one. So in terms of Japanese football, there is a book that I will recommend, and it's kind of out of print, but it's called. Let me make sure I have the title correctly. It is called Japanese Rules by Sebastian Moffat. It was published in 2000 or 2001, basically ahead of the 2002 World Cup. And it is a very good history of the J.League sort of launch in Japan. And it isn't necessarily a complete story. It is very, in a lot of ways, the perspective that the J.League and the Japan Football Association were happy to tell. But for now, it is the best written history in English that exists on the J.League for that period of time. So if you're interested in learning more about Japanese football and how we got here, or at least how we got to the point where Japan qualified for France and then was able to co-host in 2002. That's a good starting point, as good a starting point as any. And yeah, I think there's a lot out there. Well, unfortunately, there isn't too much about Japanese football that's in print. That's something that I'd like to change one day myself, because there's just so much to be written. But unfortunately, if you want to read some of the best long form writing about Japanese football, the only way to do that is to learn Japanese, because so much of it is just untranslated and is behind the wall of language, such as it is.
This is great. This is awesome. Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for bringing us into the Japanese way of seeing things, and obviously Japanese football. Personally, I think that this is an episode that requires another episode, just because of how much we could have gone into, and obviously we don't have that much time to do that. But I look forward to having you in the future for future episodes if you have me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. I always get this problem when I do other podcasts. They say, oh, we'll need half an hour. And then an hour later, we're finishing recording and making plans to do another episode. But no, I think that the fact that I can go on and on and on and on about Japanese football, the marketing, the business side, and we've kind of barely touched on the players themselves and the teams and everything that they represent. And I think that speaks to, Japanese football may only have, professional football only has a 32-year history in Japan, but what a time it has been, and just the fact that it has grown so quickly. Not only have the branches spread wide, but those roots are getting deeper and deeper. You spoke to it, from 10 teams to 60, covering nearly all of Japan's 47 prefectures. I think there's only 5 that have not had a J-League club yet. 4 or 5, and we're whittling those down. We'll get there someday. So there's the best time to start following Japanese football is always now. I tell people, and because there's so much that you're going to discover.
Yeah, that's true. And I've been trying to follow, and obviously after this discussion, I'll definitely be following Japanese football. Thank you so much, Dan, for coming on to the Football Economy. Listeners, viewers, if you've enjoyed this episode, please share with like-minded football interested participants, and let's continue to have this discussion on following episodes. And if you like this episode also, please do subscribe. Until next time, have a good one. Bye.